Now let us open in our Bibles to the book of Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5 and verse 6. Romans chapter 5 and verse 6. For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. I'm a little bit partial to this verse. In fact, I'm a whole lot partial to this verse because I was saved through this verse. And so I love it. To me, it is just a verse that depicts a God who loves to express things so simply. It just shows something of His heart. It shows something of the way that He presents the gospel and loves to present it in such a simple way that a little child that was not a brainwave or anybody above average, no prodigy by any means, just a simple child on Prince Edward Island, that I could drink in the truth of the gospel and I could be saved. And saved through what this verse tells me. These are amazing words. Don't allow familiarity to breed contempt in your mind so that you now forget to really think about the words. For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. I want to think first of all of the history that is presented in these words. Because that little word "we" and "yet" presents to us something of a look into the past. There is something of an assessment, almost as if Paul, by the Spirit of God, is drawing a line, a string from the ages of human history, right from Adam's fall, and he's drawing it out right across humanity and right into his day. And he is saying, for when we were yet. So he is looking almost as if it's right across human history. And in the book of Romans here, he's kind of pulling from every class that he could draw from in his day. And he says it doesn't matter whether we reach into the past. And it doesn't matter whether we reach to the heathen man who knows nothing of the gospel and knows nothing of God. In fact, it was mentioned he wasn't a heathen man. But it was mentioned just the power of creation and how that speaks today at the dinner table. How that George Campbell, laying on his back, looking at the stars. And he understood from the stars themselves that there must be somebody who made all of that. There must be someone who made all of that. And he wondered about that God. Well, in the book of the Romans, it's drawing from history, but also historically, even the evidence of everything that is seen in his day. And he says, even a heathen man, he is without excuse, regardless of what age they live in, regardless of a lack of teaching and a lack of knowledge. Even if all they had was creation itself, the heavens, the earth, everything. Look at your own little hand. I mean, it's amazing to think of how that hand works. All the little bones and muscles and ligaments and everything that works together. And then imagine if God forgot to put the nerve endings in there, so you couldn't feel anything as you went to pick it up. I think just the hand itself is an amazing thing, that it has the strength. It has the gentleness. It has the feeling. It tells you if you touch something hot or something sharp, because we feel it. Imagine if there was no feeling, even that in itself. The miracle that is in our hand. And yet we have two of them, just alike, side by side. And feet perfectly designed for walking. I think it is an amazing thing. But I mean, that's just us. Look at creation above us. The stars declare the handiwork. The heavens themselves. And we are looking every day into things, we take them for granted, but they leave anybody without excuse, even if they didn't hear the gospel, that there is a God. And if there is a God as big as all that, it only stands to reason that He will take this world and human beings with intelligence into account for what we do in this life. So Paul says that even if all we had was the heavens, they declare the power of the Godhead. They declare something of His person. And it is seen in creation itself. But then he says, there are some people, he says, they don't have the law as the Jew had. There are even friends that you have, and we can draw them alongside with those people. And they haven't had the teaching that you had, and yet there's something inside them that they do have that tells them a system of right and wrong. It's conscience. Conscience cannot be explained apart from the fact that God put it into us. God gave us a consciousness of right and wrong. And wherever you go in the world, there is at least something of a conscience that tells us that we're doing something right and we're doing something wrong. There's a certain code of ethics by which we should operate. And Paul says that those people will have no law. They're a law unto themselves. And again, it is something of the Godhead that is being told out. But then he comes ahead and he talks about the Jew with all of his religion, with all of his law. And he says, they themselves, he brings 14 charges in chapter 3 down across all of humanity, including the Jew. None righteous, no, not one. None that doeth good. Destruction and misery in their ways. Throat is an open sepulchre, and the poison of asps under their lips. Right on down through. So that he now proves that the whole world is guilty before God. And Paul just is summing it up here again in chapter 5. And he says, that's human history. That's a sampling from the past. We are a sampling of the present. Wherever you look, our heart is no different. He includes himself. You see, Paul himself was someone who was well taught in Scriptures. Not only did he have the best of teaching in the best Bible school of the day, you might say, brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, but he also had a diligence that people don't normally exhibit. He went after it. He says, I profited in my religion. Galatians chapter 1, he says, above mine equals, above my peers. He said, I was so intent. And yet in this verse, he takes his place in human history and he says, when we were yet without strength. So he says, not only were the uncultured people, not only those who just had conscience, but we who had all the teachings of the law, we who had all the knowledge, we who should have known it. He says, the law did not benefit us in the sense that it gave us strength to please God. And Paul did not understand that. He says, even with the law, even with the best of intentions, yet he says, when we were yet without strength. Now, that may seem like a whole lot of preamble about nothing. But I want you just to stop and think about this. Because you see, many of you are Christians' children. And you look and you somehow think, well, there's them and then there's us. But we're not really the same. My sins are not as bad as someone else's. And you look at people and maybe you don't even realize you're doing it. We all do it. And we sort of look down our noses and think, well, you know, we're just a little bit better in the way we act. But our hearts are the same. And regardless of whether it is someone who has no upbringing, they have never been taught right from wrong as we know it, or whether it is the best behaved Christian's child, we in this verse understand that the whole of human history brought to bear in this when we were yet, it affects all of us. It means that we have to include ourselves and we have to admit that I am a sinner without strength. I can do nothing to save myself. Now, do you know what happens if you were to try to be saved tonight? You would look for something to do. You would look for somehow that you have to just complete the puzzle. You have to put the last piece in place. God is waiting for you to do something. No, God is not waiting for you to do something, because the truth is that you can do nothing. You're without strength. That's what he's saying. It's like a person who medically the doctor has come in and there is absolutely nothing they can do for themselves. Whether it is that ancient disease of leprosy that has left them so defiled and so completely bereft of friends and a sense of well-being, and now they are just at their last and they can't even lift a finger to make themselves better. That's what we are spiritually speaking before God. We are without strength. We are like a person that there's nothing, no response and no ability to please God. And that has been true. Paul says, even with 4,000 years of human history that has rolled its course across all of humanity, and it reaches right into the present. When we were yet. yet without strength. Know what he would say if he was alive and well today? Still, in 2017, with not one person that can do one thing to save themselves. That's how serious sin is. And so all of human history is here. You see, sometimes we don't like our medical history, but we have to admit it. I have a truck driver's license from back in my farming days, and I still maintain the medical and all that, just because I hate to let it go. I don't know why, but anyway, I still end up driving a truck now and again. It's not a tractor-trailer license, it's just a 10-wheeler license, but when I go for my medical, and there's a whole big long form to fill out and all that kind of stuff, and of course one of the things in there is the history of your family. What conditions were there? Was there cancer? Was there blood pressure problems? Was there whatever? Diabetes. And so, we wouldn't really think twice. We may not like it. But we can be honest in a form like that. We can fill it out. But you know what? When it comes to the spiritual medical history, sometimes we don't want to we don't want to confess. We wouldn't want to put it in writing. Just exactly how God sees us. But God has put it in writing. And the Bible tells us what He sees in us. And this verse is one of those verses that just condenses, in a nutshell, the human condition across all of human history and across all of civilization and across all of humanity when we were yet without strength. There is history. But then think with me just a minute of the mysteries in this verse. Because there are mysteries in this verse. I think this is a tremendous mystery. That when we were yet without strength, Christ died. You know why that is such a tremendous mystery? It's because anyone who is God, they cannot die. They are immortal. They're undying. It seems to me if we could step into eternity itself, and if we could speak with the angels in heaven before, like just back in the ages of time or even before, if somehow we could speak with an angel from that time period, before Christ came into the world, before all of that happened, and if we could just draw alongside an angel and say, listen, do you think it would be possible for him to die? I think they would say blasphemy. Away from here to suggest such a thing. Imagine if we asked them, well, do you think that ever he could become a man? They would say, blasphemy. To think that God's only Son would lower himself to take a place with humanity. He has created humanity. To me, these are tremendous mysteries that the Bible lays out. And yet it is not a human being that suggests it, as we are forwarding to you to think about. This is the plan of God. That God's only Son would become incarnate. He would take upon him human flesh and blend it with deity, with humanity in one person. And in that body that he took upon himself, the God-man, God and man together, blended into one, he actually at Calvary's cross, he experienced death firsthand. I mean, to think of him even feeling pain in a body. It was a body that allowed him to feel pain. It was a body that allowed him to be weary, to sit on a wayside well, to speak to a woman who needed God's salvation. It was a body that allowed him to experience the thirst of the cross that was genuine when he said, I thirst. But it was a body that allowed him to dismiss his spirit and to die. And this verse brings before us what I think it is likely the most tremendous mystery of all of time. This is something to me that is absolutely amazing. It is tremendous to think just alone these two words, that Christ died. Have you ever stopped to think about that? You see, normally, I read something that impressed me the other day. Apparently Elon Musk, you know, the Tesla car, and the guy who's trying to send up developing technology to go to Mars and all the rest of it. And they actually have given him license to put in bids and all that. They actually are trusting him to do it. He can do it a lot cheaper than NASA can do it. Well, good for him. But anyway, in his manufacturing, I think it was in the Tesla Motor Company, apparently he has one of the highest rates of injury that are in the industry. A lot of people are injured on the job in his manufacturing facilities. I don't remember the statistics because I was just reading it in a flash and it was just coming to me now, so I'm bringing it out to you. So that's very serious when people are injured on the job. Now, most people would delegate someone to look after it and improve it. Maybe he's tried that, I'm not sure. But you know what he has now done? He has issued a letter and he has sent it to every employee in the corporation, at least in that division, that for any injury that takes place on the job, they are to personally report it to him. He wants to meet with them personally. In fact, he went so far as to say that he actually intends to come down and do the job that they did where they were injured, so that he can see for himself why they were injured. That's quite a thing for a man that has a place like he has in the manufacturing and the technology world, Elon Musk. But I want to tell you, there's an even more tremendous story than that. He didn't just come down to live as we lived, to be injured as we were injured. But this verse brings before us a third mystery that I think is beyond even the telling of it, yet I have to tell you about it. And you know it. Christ died for the ungodly. Christ came down and he lived life in a human body without sin. And then according to the divine plan, he stepped into the sinner's place and bore his punishment. And it says Christ died in the stead of the ungodly. The ones who had committed the offenses against God. I can't even think of how I could begin to tell you the mysteries of that in itself. But I know that the verse just tells it as simply and as concisely as it can be told in different verses from our Bible. And this is one of them. That when we were yet without strength, when we could do nothing, he looked upon us in pity. He looked upon a world that would reject him, would despise him. He knew the ones that would smite him, that would spit on him, that would rip the hairs from his cheeks. He knew all of the sufferings that they would cause him. And yet, manifesting who he was, even at the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, the very ones that were causing him his pain. The sinners around his feet. And he was proving that God was serious and that he himself as God truly loved those sinners that were doing the very things to him at that point. And it proves to me that regardless of who the sinner is, whether they be a great sinner or maybe in their eyes not so much of a sinner, however you would look at yourself, the verse tells you whether you receive it or not, whether you step out in faith on it or not. It tells me this, that Christ died in the stead of the ungodly. I think of a meeting that Mr. Hunt spoke in. I was there that night. I remember him doing it. I wasn't speaking with him. It's him and Peter Ramsey. And Jennifer was sitting in those meetings. And one of the nights, Mr. Hunt spoke in this verse. Sorry for stealing his thunder. If you would have told the story some night, but they'll forget. Don't worry about it. Jennifer was sitting in the meeting. And he was preaching from this verse. And just at the end, he quoted it one more time. And he said, Christ died for. And I could see him yet. He just stood there with his hands out like this. And he looked the audience over. And he said, you can finish it. Let's pray. And Jennifer, a young mother in that audience, at that point understood and accepted it by faith, was me. That's what happened to me one night in a gospel meeting as well. Mr. Grattan was speaking from Grand Bend, Ontario. He used to come to Prince Edward Island for the summers. And he was speaking about a woman that was couldn't read, couldn't write, but she became very concerned in gospel meetings that she was on the road to hell. And he arrived at her farmhouse one day, and she was sitting at the table in tears because she said, I do not want to go to hell. Mr. Grattan, I do not want to go to hell. So we read her many different verses from the Bible, and she couldn't seem to see any light. She just couldn't get beyond the fact that I'm going to hell, and I can do nothing about it. Maybe there's someone tonight and you realize that's true. Well, this woman was at the end of herself. She didn't care who knew. And as Mr. Grattan read verses, finally he turned her to Romans 5 and 6. And he asked her to read it. And she couldn't read hardly at all. Could she read? And she very haltingly read, for when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. And as a little boy of 6, I'm sitting just up in the second or third row, about third seat in, with my parents, and I'm listening to this story and thinking, that's me. I'm on the road to hell because of my sins. And there's nothing I can do about it. I'm just a sinner, just a little sinner on the road to hell. And as Mr. Grattan told the story of Mrs. Parks, he asked her to continue reading repeatedly the last words. Christ died for the ungodly. She would read it and then she would lift her eyes and look at him. And he said, read it again. So she would read again. Christ died for the ungodly. Finally, he asked her to read it enough times that she forgot to look at Mr. Grattan. And she read it. A woman on the road to hell. With tears in her eyes, she read it. Christ died for. And she stopped. And a little 6-year-old boy in that meeting stopped. And it dawned on me what God was trying to tell me through the verse. That when He died all those years ago, I knew He died for sin. And I knew He died for sinners. But I understood for the first time that when He did that, He was actually thinking of me. That was how it appealed to me. He was actually thinking of David Hierlihy. And He died for me. And sitting right there, I didn't even think whether I should believe it or whether I could believe it or nothing of the sort. I just accepted it as truth. And I knew that there was no reason God ever had to send me to hell, because Christ had suffered everything I deserved. That's what the verse is saying. I should tell you, Mrs. Parks, she, after pausing, she closed her hands. Mr. Grattan had long bony fingers. She would tell it like this, and she suddenly put her hands together. She said, for me. Well, in the story, I had gotten saved just before that. But it's a wonderful story, and it's the truth of the verse. Just to accept that He did what He did for me. That is the history. When we were yet without strength. The mysteries in the verse. That Christ would become flesh. That He would die, but that He would die for me. And you know what? In that verse, that's the victory over sin. It's the victory over hell. It is that which Satan himself cannot refuse. It is that from which, when a person grasps and claims, and God saves him, death itself has no sting, and power, the grave has no victory. Hell cannot touch them. But they're bound for heaven. Forever. I want to tell you it's a wonderful truth. And in that we find the victory that Christ died for me.